Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 273, Grief. Hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, I hate to be a Debbie Downer. Are you mentally prepared to talk about grief?
I am mentally prepared. I've put myself into a somber and respectful frame of... it didn't last.
Well, let's say it'll be good grief, a good grief discussion.
Oh, we have to talk about Charlie Brown.
Of course we do, sure.
Yeah.
Well, before we talk about grief and Charlie Brown, or whatever else comes to mind, we want to remind you that this episode is available through our show notes at ihose.co/trifles273. All lowercase. That will bring you to SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, where we will have any necessary links and all kinds of other tricks and trinkets for you to browse through. Of course, if you would like to support the show on Patreon, we have a button there, or you can just go to patreon.com/trifles. And we should remind you, in the next episode, in episode 273, we are doing 2 drawings for our Patreon supporters. The monthly drawing, where the winner gets a back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and the quarterly drawing, where they get a year's subscription to the Baker Street Journal. So, big prize there. So make sure you are a contributing sponsor, or a contributing patron, I should say, on Trifles. Well, we said we'd talk about grief here. Now, we should remind you that back in Season 4, I think episode 169, we did a live recording that time. It was about loneliness and isolation in the canon. I think we were at the beginning. My goodness, that was from late March 2020. Goodness, 2 years ago. We were at the beginning of the pandemic. And how far we've come, Bert. But look, there's a lot of grief going around in the world right now. We've got the war in Ukraine right now. We've certainly got people that are still enduring the pandemic, and grief is a part of life. I think there's a great quote off of the Disney Plus series WandaVision, and that was, "What is grief if not love persevering?" And I just think that's a beautiful way to look at it, because when we experience grief, it's because we care so deeply about someone or something, and the loss thereof ends up affecting us deeply. And the canon, the Sherlock Holmes stories, provide all sorts of glimpses into the world of grief, from the very first story all the way through the final story. And we thought we would spend a little time here calling out some of those elements of grief, who was affected and why, and most importantly, looking at how Victorians dealt with grief. So, Bert, that is your cue to step up and give us a little history lesson here on grief.
A history lesson on grief. Well, it's an important context, particularly when you're dealing with Arthur Conan Doyle. When we speak of the life of Conan Doyle, so much of his experience and interest is colored by his investigations into spiritualism, and the root of that, people usually point to the death of his nephew, his brother, his son, who all died in World War I. But actually, it goes back much farther than that. When you look at Conan Doyle's life, depending on the source you're looking at, you'll find that he had 6 siblings, he had 7 siblings. Actually, Arthur Conan Doyle was one of 10 children. His first child born to his mother, Annette Mary Frances Conan Doyle, who was known as Nan, was born 3 years before Conan Doyle. She died in 1890 in a flu epidemic. But before that, before Conan Doyle was born, he had a sister, Catherine Amelia Angela, who died in childbirth, and that was the first death. And then Conan Doyle was born, and he had, after that, a sister was born 2 years later, Mary Helena, Monica Henrietta. She died in childbirth at age 2 when Conan Doyle was 4 years old. And that left, in addition to his sister Annette, Lottie, Constance, who married E.W. Horning, his brother Innes, who passed away after World War I, Jane, Ida Foley, and then the last child, Brian Mary. So the point of this is that, particularly in the environment in Edinburgh, in the Victorian age, in England, in Britain, in the 1850s and 60s, death was everywhere. Victorians treated death very morbidly and in public. Sending your loved one off into the hereafter was a big deal. And the life expectancy, of course, at the time was a little bit more than 42 years of age. Somewhere I found a statistic in the 19th century, 3 children out of every 20 died before their first birthdays. And if you were poor, even with a very meager income, you saved for future funerals, because the shame of burying someone in your family in a pauper's grave was huge. And of course, for the middle classes and the upper classes, this was a big socially important event. People wore mourning dress. That's obviously closely associated with Queen Victoria's mourning for her departed husband, Albert. And the mourning dress showed your state of grief. And you could wear mourning dress, for up to 2.5 years. Women would be wearing black crepe, black caps. And then as the mourning period wore on, women could wear purple or gray. Women were expected to stay at home while men could work through their grief. And this was also a time where people created lockets of hair cut from the dead, death masks, created in wax and bronze, and that custom continued, into the 1920s. Big symbols of death in painting and sculptures. So this is huge amplification of your observation that, grief is part of life, and we see grief sort of running through the canon as different characters, different people cope with great emotional upsets.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because as often as we kind of refer to the Victorian era as an era where people were very stoic, they didn't show their emotions, this was a very significant outward expression of grief. You literally wore it on your sleeve for the gentleman. And it's not surprising then that great urban legend was given life, that after Sherlock Holmes passed away, grown men wore black crepe on their armbands as a symbol of sorrow over his loss. Now, it's never been documented anywhere, and I think it makes a lovely kind of story around the popularity of Sherlock Holmes, but it just goes to show how eminently believable it would have been, because that was just part of how people lived at the time.
Yes, yeah, eminently believable indeed. I think Ira Mitetsky had a paper in the Baker Street Journal where he sort of disproved this finally. But the fact is, it is eminently believable, and it's the whole point, as you point out, is to have this sort of public recognition so that as people encounter you, they understand you're in an emotional state.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we pause here for a brief word, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the expressions of grief that we find in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Stay with us. One of the legacies that former head of the Baker Street Irregulars, Mike Whalen, left us is the BSI Press. The BSI Press has published more than 60 volumes related to Sherlock Holmes. These include the manuscript series, which provides facsimile editions of manuscripts and other documents relating to Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, along with insightful commentary by talented Sherlockian and Doylean writers. The latest is a masterpiece of villainy, which is a look at the Norwood Builder. The BSI Profession series examines roles played by various professions in the Sherlockian canon: law, medicine, military, education, and now, music, in Referring to My Notes. And the BSI International Series that makes available Sherlockian scholarship in English from various countries around the world. Head on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and browse around the BSI Press section. There's something there for everyone. Okay, we are back, and we are about to address grief in the canon. And, there's a number of ways that grief is expressed, either in mourning or simply by use of the term grief or grieved. But why don't we start at the beginning with a study in Scarlet, because here is an example of grief that turns to vengeance, where we have Jefferson Hope, who is mourning the loss of his fiancée, Lucy Ferrier, who was forced into marriage with Enoch Drebber. And we're told that her sottish husband, who had married her principally for the sake of John Ferrier's property, did not affect any great grief at his bereavement. But his other wives mourned over her and sat up with her the night before the burial, as is the Mormon custom. Well, that short paragraph, that sentence really starkly disassociates the character of Enoch Drebber from the character of Jefferson Hope.
Yes, it does. Well, also, too, there's this constant theme in the cases of Sherlock Holmes about evil coming from outside the British Empire. And in a study in Scarlet, Conan Doyle has a few lines where he talks about what's really driving Jefferson Hope. And he says, Jefferson Hope possessed a power of... Hope is presented as this very strange character, possessed of a power of sustained vindictiveness, which, Conan Doyle says, he might have learned from the Indians amongst whom he'd lived. And as he stood by the desolate fire, he felt that the only one thing which could assuage his grief would be thorough and complete retribution brought by his own hand upon his enemies.
Wow. Intense. That is intense indeed. Let's just take a quick look, because we had come out of the break there talking about mourning attire. And I think nowhere is it more specifically called out than in the Greek Interpreter. It's just a very short scene, but of course it's that famous scene where Sherlock and Mycroft are at the window of the Diogenes Club looking down onto the street, making deductions about the gentleman they see down in the street, and then describing how they came to their conclusions. And in this case, Mycroft says, then, of course, his complete mourning shows that he has lost someone very dear. The fact that he's doing his own shopping looks as though it were his wife. He had been buying things for children, you perceive. There's a rattle, which shows that one of them is very young. The wife probably died in childbed. The fact that he has a picture book under his arm shows that there's another child to be thought of. So you think about, just as you were saying, Bert, how death was all around in the Victorian times. And it wasn't just the children that were dying at extraordinary rates compared to what we know today, but the mothers as well. Childbirth was a very, very dangerous and difficult process. And I think the Victorian times, you think about widows more than widowers. Queen Victoria, of course, being the most famous widow of her time and dressing in black for the rest of her life. But the reality is there were plenty of widows out there that then had to care for their own families as well. So it's brought to life.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. And widowers who rapidly, or I shouldn't say rapidly, but who then, remarried and attempted to, carry on with extensions of their family.
Yeah.
There's another case of Sherlock Holmes, the barrel coronet, in which grief is sort of pasted on by Watson in lots of ways. But just as we saw Jefferson Hope having a strange character motivated by grief that drives him to vindictiveness, the theft of the barrel coronet promotes an enormous amount of extreme behavior on the part of Holmes's client. And so when he first finds out that the jewels have been stolen and he believes that it's his son who's responsible, he cries half mad with grief and rage. And then when he's talking to Sherlock Holmes, Watson tells us he puts a hand, the client, on either side of his head and rocked himself to and fro, droning to himself like a child whose grief has got beyond words. And then later in the case, we see his niece, and as she swept silently into the room, Watson says, she impressed me with a greater sense of grief than the banker had done in the morning. Oh, my God, what could that have been? And then when the gems come back, the reaction of joy was as passionate as his grief had been, and he hugged his recovered gems to his bosom. And then when they catch the villain, and Holmes confronts him and tells him what he would pay to get the gems back, Holmes says, that brought out the first signs of grief he'd shown. Why, dash it all, I've let them go for much less. And so, grief is sort of this stimulant, this sort of kickoff of, behavior and expression and a motivator of extremity in emotion in that particular story.
Yeah, I mean, it does come down to desperation, and it's grief about obviously about the loss of a physical object, but more importantly, it's grief about the potential loss of stature and status in society for Holder, because this, his honor is at stake, having claimed this bit of bauble on behalf of a client would have been just a disgrace. So, well, let's turn to grief as it comes to the human source. Just a couple of brief ones. Obviously, one of the most tragic stories in the there's a number of tragic stories in the canon, but from a personal perspective, the Dancing Men. You think about Elsie Cubitt sitting there holding her dead husband in her arms after having been tormented by her former fiancé, and he puts the gun to her temple and attempts suicide. You think of the level of despair and grief that she must have been driven to take that kind of step, to think that she couldn't live without her beloved Hilton. And then we have this is an interesting one, and it's almost a footnote, because it serves as the introduction to a lot of action. But if we pause on it, in the Man with the Twisted Lip, remember Kate Whitney came to Watson's house, and she was looking for Mrs. Watson, and she says, "I didn't know what to do, so I came straight to you." And Watson writes, "That was always the way. Folk who were in grief came to my wife like birds to a lighthouse." I think, isn't that fascinating? That very small vignette of Mrs. Watson and her compassion and empathy and ability to help people in need. No wonder she was such a great match for Watson.
Oh, that's really well said. I like that. I like that a lot. And I think you're very right to pay attention to that reference. And, when I think of stories in which the grief is extreme, in addition to the ones you've mentioned, I think of The Missing Three-Quarter, of course, because that has this great denouement. We've been looking for this missing rugby player, and we find him at the foot. A woman, young and beautiful, was lying dead upon the bed, her calm, pale face with dim, wide-opened blue eyes looked upward from amid a great tangle of golden hair. At the foot of the bed, half sitting, half kneeling, his face buried in the clothes, was a young man whose frame was racked by his sobs. So absorbed was he by his bitter grief that he never looked up until Holmes' hand was on his shoulder. "Are you Mr. Godfrey Staunton?" And then later, to the earlier observation that men were expected to work through their grief, after his wife dies of consumption, this virulent consumption, we learn the poor boy was half crazed with grief, and yet he had to go to London to play this match. And it's just, it tells you so much there, in particular, Watson, or should we say Doyle's familiarity with the reality of a sad death due to horrible illness and what it looked like.
It really is. And I think, and there's probably a half dozen other instances of grief that we could point out throughout the canon, but I think it's probably best that we settle on what I think is the biggest gut punch. It's a 1-2 punch for Watson. Throughout this journey with Sherlock Holmes, we spent a lot of time focusing on the cases themselves, but you think about the timeline and the relationships. And we just talked about Mrs. Watson being a wonderful match for her husband. Well, in the final problem, Watson had to deal with the loss of Holmes. He arrived back, or what he thought was the loss of Holmes. He arrived back at the Reichenbach Falls after being waylaid, and the quote, as he kind of sums up what he was observing there and what his final conclusions were, he said, "I stood for a minute or two to collect myself, for I was dazed with the horror of the thing." And that phrase has always stood out to me, dazed with the horror of the thing. I mean, if that doesn't represent, this gut punch of, what will become great grief over the loss of a friend and colleague, Watson captures it there. Of course, he's writing this in retrospect, so he is full on in his moment of grief. But then, when Holmes finally returns, which must be amazing to Watson, certainly it makes him faint at the very least, but when he begins talking with Holmes, again, this is just a glance. He says, "In some manner he learned of my own sad bereavement, and his sympathy was shown in his manner rather than his words. Work is the best antidote to sorrow, my dear Watson," said he. So there, in the span of 3 short years while Holmes was away, it's clear that Watson had lost his wife. He lost Holmes and then lost his wife as a 1-2 punch, and Holmes comes back, and as you say, having to get back to work. As men generally did. That was the antidote for sorrow, for grief.
Well, it's true, and no one, with his experience of life, with the sad deaths he too must have witnessed over the years, and his medical practice and his time in Afghanistan, no one was better equipped, I think, to get back to that rewarding work that has left us with this wonderful body of literature.
And that is no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
But you were lying about Elsie.
Plainly, when you shot and killed Hilton Cubitt, Elsa Cubitt, in her despair, attempted to kill herself and is now at death's door.
No.